It was nearly 1 in the morning when rain hammered the glistening black asphalt outside the Wellmont Hotel, and in the yellow pool of a streetlight, 6 large men could not subdue the beast snarling in their midst. The Neapolitan Mastiff, nearly 70 kilos, lunged left to right, 2 lengths of broken chain still swinging from its neck. One guard clutched a shredded arm and stumbled back against a lamppost. Another screamed himself hoarse for a tranquilizer gun. A third sprawled across the wet pavement, scrambling away from those long white teeth, but the dog wasn't chasing them down to maul them. It spun in circles, back arched, bloodshot eyes darting for an escape that didn't exist, the eyes of a creature that human hands had frightened beyond all reason. On the stone steps, leaning against the black car that had just pulled up, a man stood perfectly still. Adriel Castellano, a name the whole city, lowered its voice to speak. That night he had ordered an underground dogfighting ring beneath the city torn apart, and this was the only thing he'd brought back. An animal chained its entire life to bite and tear, now unable to tell which hand was the whip and which was the rescue. 6 of his men stood there, helpless. In all his years, Adriel had never met a thing that couldn't be bought, forced, or broken, until tonight. Then he heard a voice. "Don't shoot him," a few steps away, where the staff path spilled into the alley behind the hotel. A woman set down a bag of trash. She was thin, soaked through, wrapped in a faded waitress uniform, and her belly was round and full beneath the thin apron. 8 months. Marisol Reyes crossed the line that 6 armed men hadn't dared to, one hand cradling her belly, the other trembling as she held it out toward the snarling beast. In her open palm lay a tiny piece of bread, saved from her own late-night meal. "Stop her!" someone shouted, but Adriel raised a hand. Even he didn't understand why he held them back. He only knew that, in the moment that small woman stepped into the ring of death, the entire empire of power he had built over 34 years fell silent enough to choke on, and for the first time in his life, Adriel Castellano held his breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Something none of them, himself included, could ever have imagined. If this moment made you hold your breath the way Adriel did, hit like and share so this story can reach even more hearts. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to follow Marisol and the dog named Bruno all the way to the end of their journey. Marisol didn't take another step. She stopped about 3 steps away from the dog, close enough for it to smell her, far enough that it wouldn't feel cornered. The hand holding out the piece of bread was still trembling, but she didn't lower it. She kept it exactly where it was, palm open, not clenched, not pulling back, not making a single movement that could be mistaken for a threat. Then she began to speak. Her voice was low, steady, almost no more than a breath. "It's all right. No one's going to hurt you anymore. There's no one here who's going to hurt you anymore." She repeated each sentence slowly, not so the dog could understand the meaning, but so it could hear something it had never heard before in a human voice. Calmness. Bruno froze in the middle of the yard. Its shoulders were still braced, its back still arched, but the growl in its throat had begun to break apart, coming and going, like a machine slowly running out of fuel. It had been struggling for too long. White foam clung to the corners of its mouth. Its chest rose and fell in frantic bursts. Its bloodshot eyes remained fixed on the woman before it, but something else had begun to stir in that gaze. It was no longer pure hostility. It was the confusion of an animal that couldn't understand why the person standing closest to it was the only one who wasn't raising a hand against it. 1 step. The dog edged 1 step toward her. Behind her, one of the bodyguards hurriedly raised his hand. Marisol gave a slight shake of her head without turning around. "Don't! Just 1 word." The man's hand froze in midair. On the steps, Adriel still hadn't moved, but his eyes had changed. He was used to seeing people obey because they feared him, but this woman had made an armed man stand still with a single word spoken on a breath, and she'd done it without even bothering to look back. Then another step. Bruno was close enough now for Marisol to see the marks around its neck, where the chain had once bitten into its flesh year after year. She didn't look for long. She knew animals could read pity in someone's eyes as quickly as they could read hatred, and both made them wary. She simply kept her hand still, kept her voice still, kept her whole body still, like an unshakable anchor in the middle of its panic. "I know you're scared. I've been scared like that too, but this piece of bread is real. I'm not taking it back." The dog lowered its head. It sniffed the piece of bread in her palm, its hot breath trembling against her skin. In a moment that stretched so long it seemed to steal the air from everyone's lungs. No one in the yard dared to move. All 6 men stood rooted in place, their eyes fixed on the small hand held between the jaws of an animal that had just knocked 3 of them to the ground. Marisol didn't breathe either. She only waited, as she had learned long ago that patience wasn't weakness, but the only kind of strength that didn't need violence. Then Bruno gently licked the piece of bread from her hand, swallowed it, and stood still. Its arched back slowly lowered. The growl died completely. That enormous dog, the creature 6 grown men hadn't been able to subdue, now stood silent before a pregnant woman. Its head lowered, as if all the rage inside it had been drained away by nothing more than a piece of bread and a voice that held no fear. Marisol slowly lifted her other hand and rested it gently on its forehead. Bruno shuddered once, then stayed still. On the stone steps, Adriel Castellano watched the scene before him and forgot that he was even standing there. All his life, he had believed power was something a man seized through fear, that if he wanted to control others, he had to make them terrified of him. He had built an entire empire on that belief, and yet that woman had just done what money, weapons, and 6 of his men couldn't do, and she had done it with the exact opposite of everything he knew. He slowly stepped down one stair, his eyes never leaving her, and for the first time in many years, Adriel realized a question was rising inside his chest, one he couldn't silence no matter how hard he tried. Who was this woman? That still, suspended moment was torn apart by the sound of shoes striking the wet stone. Owen Marsh, the broad-shouldered man who led the bodyguards, strode forward, his face hardened by humiliation and anger. "You there. Let go of the dog and leave now. This isn't a place for outsiders." His voice was rough, and his hand was already settling on Marisol's shoulder, about to pull her back. Bruno instantly tensed, a low growl rumbling up from deep in its throat, and Owen jerked his hand away on instinct, as though he had touched fire. Marisol didn't move. She only tightened her hand slightly where it rested on the dog's forehead, and strangely, the growl stopped at once. "I'm sorry," she said softly, not to defend herself, but only to keep the air from shattering. "I only meant to take out the trash and leave, but it was about to hurt itself, so I couldn't walk away." "Put your hand down, Owen." Adriel's voice rose from behind her, not loud, not hurried, but enough to make the whole courtyard seem to sink by a breath. Every man standing there immediately shifted his posture, back straightening, eyes lowering, as if a single sentence from him was enough to rearrange the order of the space around them. Owen stepped back, swallowed whatever he had been about to say, and silently returned to the line. Marisol saw it all. She didn't know who this man was, but she knew how to read a room, and this room had just told her that he was someone even men carrying guns knew to fear. She had met enough kinds of people during all her years waiting tables in late-night diners to understand that the most frightening kind of power was the kind that didn't need to raise its voice. Adriel walked toward her and stopped a few steps away, his gaze moving from her face, pale from the cold, down to the hand still resting on the animal his men hadn't been able to subdue. "What's your name?" he asked. "Marisol Reyes," she answered, her voice calm, though her shoulders trembled faintly from the night cold that had soaked through her thin uniform. "What are you doing here?" "Marisol Reyes. I work the night shift in the hotel restaurant," she said. "When my shift ended, I brought out the trash, and then I heard it. That's all." She said nothing more. She didn't explain, didn't plead, didn't beg, and that very restraint caught Adriel's attention, far more than tears or desperate words ever could have. He was used to people standing before him with clumsy hands and tongues knotted by fear. This woman simply stood there, exhausted, shivering with cold, carrying a life inside her that was nearly ready to enter the world. And yet her eyes met his directly, without flinching. He turned his head to look at Bruno. The dog was still standing close beside her, head lowered, obedient in a way almost impossible to believe compared with what it had been 10 minutes earlier. All evening, 6 trained men, ropes, and shouted commands had not been able to calm it for even a second, and yet she had done it. "I need someone to take care of this dog," Adriel said, and the way he said it sounded less like an offer than a decision already formed. "It only listens to you. I don't have time for it to bite more of my men every morning. You'll come to my place every day and look after it until it's steady. I'll pay you properly, much more than this hotel pays you." Marisol hesitated. Every instinct in her told her to refuse, to go back to the alley, to the half-abandoned trash bags, to the small life she had tried so hard to keep invisible. This man gave off a kind of danger she couldn't name, and she had learned long ago that staying away from what she didn't understand was the only way to survive. But then she thought of the stack of hospital bills waiting at home, of the child soon to be born when she still didn't have enough money for a decent bed in the hospital, of the night shift, whose wages weren't even enough to keep her from trembling every time she looked at her bank account. She looked down at Bruno, at the animal now lifting eyes toward her that were no longer bloodshot with rage, and in them she saw something she understood too well, the fear of one who had been left behind. "All right," she said, so softly that almost only she could hear it. "I'll come." Marisol's rented room was on the 3rd floor of an old building on the edge of the city, where water thundered through the pipes every night and the heater only worked when it felt like it. She got home when dawn was already close, took off her shoes, soaked through with water, sank down onto the edge of the bed, pushed against the window, and let the aching exhaustion crawl through her swollen legs. She placed one hand on her belly, where the baby had just shifted as if answering her, then reached for the old tin box on the table. Inside was everything she had. She poured it out onto the blanket and counted every crumpled bill, every cold coin, her lips moving along with the numbers. It still wasn't enough. Beside it lay the stack of hospital bills, the bold printed lines she had read so many times she knew them by heart. Her due date was only about a month away, and the deposit was money she still hadn't managed to gather. She smoothed the paper with her palm, as if doing so might make the weight written on it a little lighter. It had been 7 months since she had become a widow at 26. People told her it had been an accident, that she should accept it and move on. And she had tried to do exactly that. She had tried to fold her grief into something neat and small, so she would still have the strength to live, to carry the child he had left inside her before he ever had the chance to see its face. She had no one left. No parents nearby, no relatives to call in the middle of the night, only herself, her belly growing heavier by the day, and one late shift after another until her body was worn to the bone. And yet tonight, for reasons she didn't understand, when she had placed her hand on the forehead of that terrified dog, something inside her had gone strangely still, as if in the moment she soothed another living creature's fear, she had briefly forgotten her own. She lay down, pulled the thin blanket up to her chin, and in that hazy space between waking and sleep, an old memory rose to the surface. She saw herself as a little girl, standing tucked behind the wooden fence of a dusty ranch in New Mexico, watching her father kneel for hours in front of a dog that had been starved so badly it wouldn't let anyone come near. The other men had wanted to use rope, use a whip, use force to make it obey, and every one of them had failed. Her father had only sat there, silent and patient, setting food on the ground and waiting, day after day, until the dog chose to come forward on its own. "Don't ever force a living creature to trust you," he had once told her, his voice low and slow. "Fear can't be healed with a fist. It only begins to fade when someone is willing to stay long enough for it to understand that it's safe." That was the deepest lesson he had left her, and almost the only one, because not long after that, when life became too heavy for him, he was the one who left, leaving her with a lesson about trust from a man who hadn't been brave enough to stay. Marisol smiled faintly in the dark, a smile both bitter and tender, then closed her eyes. Tomorrow she would have to wake early and go to the estate of the city's most feared and powerful man, to care for a dog only she could touch. She didn't know what she was walking into. She only knew that, for the first time in a very long while, something was waiting for her ahead, besides bills and night shifts. And she held on to that fragile thought as she drifted into sleep. The car came to pick her up in the middle of the next morning, and when it rolled through the towering gate toward the estate on the hillside north of the city, Marisol unconsciously held her breath. She had imagined many things, but not this. The whole building looked as if it had been raised from glass and steel, its transparent walls reflecting Seattle's gray sky, so clean and cold that she felt out of place from the very first step onto the front stairs. This wasn't a place meant for a woman wearing shoes worn thin at the soles, and the only coat she owned, its threads already fraying. They led her through vast hallways, where every footstep she took echoed with a lonely sound, and she could feel eyes watching from hidden corners, silent men standing guard whose faces she couldn't clearly see. Everything here breathed absolute control, an order maintained by the invisible kind of power she had glimpsed in the hotel courtyard last night. They brought her to the back area, where Bruno was being kept in a private yard enclosed by a high fence. The moment she appeared at the end of the walkway, the dog, curled tightly in a corner, suddenly snapped his head up. For an instant, his whole body tightened with the old reflex, the reflex of a creature used to seeing every human shadow as a threat. But then he recognized her. Marisol saw that moment clearly, the moment when the wariness in his eyes dissolved and was replaced by something almost like joy. Bruno stood up, came close to the fence, and instead of growling the way he did at everyone else, he only pressed his nose into the gap between two iron bars and let out a small, soft whine, the sound of an animal calling to the only person he trusted. "Hello," she said softly, kneeling down to be level with him, ignoring the heavy belly that made the movement awkward. "I came back. I promised, didn't I?" She slipped her hand through the fence, and Bruno let her touch him, rubbing his head into her palm, as if he had spent the whole night waiting for that very hand. The sight left the people standing around them stunned. The same animal that had brought their entire team to a dead end, that had torn open men's arms, that had snapped even the strongest ropes, was now lowering his head obediently before a small woman who had nothing in her hands except gentleness. There was a heartbreaking contrast in that scene, between the cold mansion built to display strength and authority, and the image of the weakest person in that place doing what all that power had failed to do. Marisol didn't notice any of it. She was only busy talking to Bruno, checking the marks around his neck where new skin had already begun to form, softly whispering words only the dog could hear. But one person did notice. Standing some distance away, half hidden in the shadow of the glass wall, Owen Marsh watched her with his arms folded, his eyes never leaving her. There was no wonder in his gaze the way there was in the others. There was something colder, more guarded, almost suspicious. He watched the way the dog trusted her after only one night, watched the way she had stepped into this place as if fate itself had arranged it, and questions he hadn't spoken to anyone began to take shape inside his mind. A woman suddenly appeared at just the right moment, did exactly what no one else could do, and was then brought straight inside by the boss himself. To Owen, coincidences like that were never only coincidences. He quietly withdrew into the house, his gaze still lingering on the small figure bending beside the dog, and the seed of suspicion inside him began to take root. The days that followed passed in a rhythm Marisol had never dared to dream of. Every morning, the car came to pick her up, and every morning, she crossed the back courtyard of the mansion to reach Bruno, the friend who was slowly learning how to trust humans again. The dog's change came slowly, little by little, in a way only someone truly patient could recognize. On the first day, he would only eat after she set the food down and stepped far away. A few days later, he was willing to eat straight from her palm. Then one morning, when she sat with her back against the fence to ease the ache in her body, Bruno came over on his own, laid his heavy head in her lap, and let out one deep, weary sigh, as if he had finally found a place where he could set down the weight he had been carrying. Marisol placed her hand on his back in silence, and she realized she was breathing out the same way. Two wounded creatures sat beside each other beneath the gray morning sky, each one growing a little less afraid with every passing day, and neither of them needed to tell the other to understand it. She didn't know that someone watched those mornings. From the glass window on the upper floor of the mansion, Adriel often stood there with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand, looking down into the yard where the small woman sat beside the dog. He couldn't understand why he kept giving his time to it. He was a man who always had hundreds of decisions to make, dozens of calls to return, and yet every morning he lingered by the window for a few extra minutes just to see how close Bruno had allowed her to come that day. There was something in the way she treated the animal that made him unable to look away, a gentleness without calculation, without demand, the kind he had never been given in his life and had never known how to give anyone else. One morning, he came down himself. Marisol heard his footsteps and looked up, her body tightening slightly when she saw him. But Bruno didn't growl at all. He only glanced up at Adriel, then tucked himself back against her. "He trusts you faster than I thought he would," Adriel said, stopping on the other side of the fence, his eyes resting on the dog. "I thought it would take months, assuming he could still be saved at all." "No one has ever given him a reason to trust," she replied, her hand still stroking gently over the animal's fur. "When someone has only received blows all their life, a hand that doesn't rise to strike is already something strange and remarkable. He doesn't need much. He only needs to know that this time will be different." Adriel stayed silent for a long while after those words, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, deeper, as if the question he was about to ask wasn't entirely about the dog. And if someone is so used to being betrayed that he no longer knows how to trust anyone, do you think he can still be saved? Marisol looked up at him, and in that moment, she understood that he was no longer speaking of Bruno. In this powerful man, she saw something she hadn't expected, an old wound carefully hidden beneath a cold shell, so deep that perhaps even he had forgotten it was still there. I think he can, she said softly, but that person has to choose for himself to give someone else a chance. No one can force trust. It only comes when we stop building walls. Adriel didn't answer. He only looked at her for a little longer, then down at the dog lying peacefully in her lap, and something very fragile, very quiet, shifted inside his chest, something he couldn't yet name, and wasn't ready to name. He turned away and walked back into the mansion. But for the rest of that day, the words of the woman sitting beside the dog kept echoing again and again in his mind, persistent as the first crack in a wall that had seemed impossible to move. A few days later, on an afternoon when Marisol stayed later than usual to clean Bruno's eating area, she accidentally stepped into a part of the world she had been trying not to look at. She was walking down the hallway toward the backyard when she heard voices drifting out from a room with its door left slightly open, and though she knew she shouldn't stop, her feet still froze when she realized that one of those voices was pleading. Through the crack in the door, she saw a well-dressed man sitting in a chair, his face pale, sweat beading across his forehead, while Adriel stood opposite him, both hands in his pockets, calm in a way that chilled the blood. This was the man she had spoken with beside the dog pen a few days earlier, the man with an old wound hidden behind his eyes, and yet now he stood there like something else entirely, and Marisol suddenly understood the true weight of the absolute authority he commanded. I hear you like forcing the people who borrow money from you to pay back 3 times what they owe, Adriel said, his voice never rising, and it was that very calm that made the air in the room turn thick and heavy. I hear a family lost the only home they had because they couldn't come up with the interest rate you decided to set on your own. The husband works 2 shifts a day. The wife just gave birth. You push them onto the street in the middle of winter. The man in the chair stammered something about contracts, about agreements, but Adriel merely raised one finger, and the excuse died at once. You're mistaken about one thing, Adriel continued, taking one step closer. You thought that because you had a little money, you had the right to grind people weaker than you into dust. But in this city, there are lines you aren't allowed to cross, and you've just crossed one of them. My people have already prepared the paperwork. Tomorrow morning, that house will be returned to the family, and everything you took from them will be paid back directly into their hands, along with the interest you once set yourself. Consider it a taste of your own formula. The man tried to protest, but Owen and another man had already stepped forward from both sides. They didn't need to touch him. They only stood there, and their presence spoke more clearly than any threat. Adriel bent down to the other man's eye level, lowering his voice until it was almost gentle, and that gentleness was the most frightening thing of all. I won't say this a second time, he said. In the city where you think you're king, there's always someone standing above you, and that person has just decided you need to learn how to behave decently again. If I hear your name tied to another vulnerable person, then next time we won't be having this conversation in a warm room like this. Do you understand? The man nodded again and again, unable to get a single word out, and Adriel straightened, turning away as if everything had already ended, as if he had just handled some trivial matter unworthy of another second of his attention. It was then that his eyes caught Marisol standing frozen by the crack in the door. For one moment, the two of them only looked at each other across the silent hallway, and she saw his face shift faintly, not with shame, but with caution, as if he were waiting to see what she would do with what she had just witnessed. Marisol tightened her grip on the towel in her hand. She had just seen a side of this man she had never seen before, the side of someone who could make powerful men tremble with nothing more than a whispered sentence. She should have been afraid. She should have turned and run, the way every instinct inside her was screaming at her to do. But she didn't move. She only stood there, her heart pounding hard, and silently registered that the man he had just punished was someone who had crushed a defenseless family with nothing to protect them. Then she turned away and walked toward the backyard, carrying inside her a tangle of feelings she didn't yet know how to name. She hadn't gone very far before she heard his footsteps following behind her. Adriel called her name, and Marisol stopped in the middle of the courtyard, her back still turned to him for one more beat before she forced herself to turn and face him. He stood a few steps away, his expression difficult to read, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw that the man who always held control over everything seemed unsure of what he was about to say. "You saw all of it," he said, not as a question, but as an admission. "Then now you know what kind of man I am." Marisol looked at him for a long while. Her heart was still pounding, but she didn't step back, didn't lower her eyes, didn't do the thing he was perhaps waiting for her to do. "I know what you just did to the man in that room," she replied, her voice so steady it surprised even her. "But I also heard why you did it. You gave a home back to a family that had been pushed into the street. I don't know which part of you I should be more afraid of. The part that can make a rich man tremble, or the part that cares about a family you've never even met." Adriel went still. He had prepared himself for many reactions, for revulsion, for an averted gaze, for her asking to quit the very next morning, and disappearing from this place like so many others had done once they saw who he truly was. He hadn't prepared himself for her to stand there, tired and small, looking straight at him as if she were trying to understand him instead of condemn him. "Most people only see the first part," he said slowly. "They see what I can do, and they run. I'm used to that." "Then why did you let me hear the rest?" she asked. Adriel didn't answer right away. "I didn't tell you," he replied after a moment. "You heard it for yourself. That's the difference." Marisol drew in a breath, and when she spoke again, her voice had softened, but it still held a clear boundary she had no intention of erasing. "I need you to understand one thing," she said. "I'm here because of Bruno, and because I need this money for my baby. I'm not here to judge who you are or what you do in your world, because that isn't my business. But I'm also not someone who will close her eyes and pretend not to see anything. I've lived my whole life by seeing people exactly as they are, no more and no less. I'll look at you that way too, and I hope you'll let me keep that. Do you understand?" That was how she drew a line between them, not to push him away, but to let him know she was walking into this world with open eyes and a clear head, that she wasn't someone easily bought with money or subdued by fear. Adriel looked at her, and for the first time in a very long while, the corner of his mouth shifted into something almost like a smile. "You're the first person in many years who has dared to set terms with me," he said. "Most people only worry about pleasing me. Then maybe most people have been wrong," she replied. "A man who only hears what pleases him will sooner or later forget what the truth looks like." The two of them stood there in the evening courtyard, and something between them had changed. A new kind of respect, quietly laid into place. When Marisol returned to Bruno to say goodbye before leaving, she noticed the dog tense slightly and release a low growl as Owen passed by at the far end of the yard, but she was still too caught up in the conversation she had just had, so she only paid it a passing thought. Then she soothed the dog until he settled again and walked out to the car beneath the fading evening light. That evening, after Marisol had gone home, Owen came to Adriel's office with the expression of a man carrying something ominous. He closed the door behind him, stood across from his boss's desk, and began speaking in the careful voice of someone who knew exactly what he was planting. "I need to be direct about something that's been bothering me these past few days," he began. "That woman. Have you ever asked yourself why she appeared on the exact night we brought the dog back? The exact hotel, the exact passageway, the exact moment when none of us could control the animal. And then, in just one night, she did what my entire team couldn't do." Adriel looked up from the stack of papers, his gaze sharpening. "What are you trying to say, Owen?" "I'm saying no one is that lucky," he replied. "I've done this work long enough to know that when something looks too perfect, too perfectly timed, it's usually because someone arranged it. We're in the middle of our most tense period with the Halloran family. If they wanted to plant someone here, who do you think they would choose? A strong man everyone would be wary of, or a pregnant woman, frail and pitiful enough that no one would have the heart to suspect her?" Adriel fell silent. He didn't want to believe it, and that very reluctance made him pause, because he had lived too long in a world where every feeling could be a trap, where trust was the most expensive luxury a person could pay for. He remembered the strange softness he felt each morning when he stood by the window looking down into the yard. He remembered what she had said about stopping the building of walls, and a part of him suddenly went cold at the thought that perhaps those very words were the most delicate trap of all. He had been betrayed enough times to know that the people who wounded him most deeply were always the ones around whom he had lowered his guard. "The dog trusts her," he said, almost as if trying to convince himself. "Animals don't know how to lie. Animals can't tell the difference between a good person and someone being paid to look good," Owen answered at once, and the sentence drove itself straight into the place where suspicion had begun to glow. "I'm not saying she's guilty. I'm only saying we know nothing about her. No past, no background, no one to vouch for her. You brought a stranger into the very heart of this place, and we don't even know who she really is." What Adriel couldn't know, what he would later blame himself for not seeing, was that Owen had a very private reason for wanting his boss's suspicion turned toward that woman. When all attention was poured onto a harmless stranger, no one would be watching the familiar faces. But at that moment, standing in that quiet room, all Adriel saw was a loyal subordinate worried for his safety, and Owen's warning sounded reasonable enough that it couldn't be dismissed. He stood, walked to the dark glass window, and looked down at the courtyard now swallowed in night, where that very morning the woman had still been sitting beside the dog. "Find out about her," he finally said, his voice returning to the familiar coldness that had, at moments over the past several weeks, begun to thaw. "Everything. Where she came from, what she did before she came here, who her family is. I want to know everything before she walks through this gate again." Owen nodded, trying to hide the brief flash of satisfaction in his eyes, and quietly left the room, leaving Adriel alone with the seed of doubt that had just been planted, a seed he didn't yet know had been placed there by the very hand he should have suspected most. It took nearly a week before Adriel's people placed the file on Marisol Reyes's life on his desk, and when he opened it, what he found wasn't evidence of a traitor, but something that left him sitting in silence for a very long time. There was no trace of the Halloran family planting her there, no suspicious accounts, no secret meetings, nothing at all except the portrait of a woman whom life had drained nearly dry. But there was one name in the file that seemed to freeze the entire room. Her late husband, the man she believed had died in an accident more than a year earlier, had in truth died for an entirely different reason. He had borrowed money to hold on to his small failing business, borrowed it straight from the Halloran family's loan sharks, and when he couldn't pay it back, they had dealt with him the way the underworld dealt with debtors who no longer had any value. What Marisol had been told was an accident was only a carefully built cover, so a young widow carrying a child in her womb would never know that her husband had died at the hands of the very enemies now surrounding the man she worked for. Adriel sat there with the file in his hands, and for the first time in a very long while, he felt something heavier than anger. The woman he had ordered investigated as a suspect turned out to be a victim of his own enemies, someone who had lost everything because of the world he was part of, while she hadn't even known it. He knew he had to tell her. He also knew that speaking this truth aloud would tear open the wound she had tried so hard to stitch shut so she could keep living. He chose to tell her one afternoon, beside the yard where Bruno still lay, because he thought that at least there she would have the dog beside her. When he set the truth down before her, word by word, slowly and without looking away, he watched her face move through every stage, from confusion to disbelief, then to that terrible moment when she understood that he was telling the truth. Marisol didn't cry right away. She only stood there, one hand supporting her belly with a reflex that had become instinct, the other slowly rising to cover her mouth, and her eyes opened wide as she stared into empty space, as if the whole world she had known had just been rewritten before her. "An accident," she whispered, her voice breaking apart. "They told me it was an accident. I believed them. For more than a year, I believed that. I stood in front of his grave and told myself it was fate, that no one was to blame." A choked sound broke out of her, half bitter laughter and half sob. "He didn't even tell me he was in debt. He carried it all alone so I wouldn't worry, and then he died alone because of it, while I kept thinking I understood the whole story of my own life." Only then did the tears come, silent and unstoppable, rolling down her face as she sank to the ground beside the fence, and Bruno immediately edged closer, pressing his whole body against her as if he understood, as if an animal that had tasted human cruelty also recognized a pain of its own kind. Marisol wrapped her arms around the dog's neck, buried her face in his fur, and let the grief she had held back for more than a year finally break open. All this time, she had blamed fate, had blamed herself for not being sharp enough to save him, when the truth was that there had been no fate here at all. Only people, only those who had taken away the father of her child and left her alone inside a lie. Adriel stood there, helpless in a way he had never known before. The man who could break anyone with a single phone call now having no way to mend what had just shattered in front of him. And as he watched her collapse against the dog and cry, something inside him quietly hardened, an unspoken promise that the people who had caused this would pay. That night, Marisol did not find her way back through sleep. She sat for a very long time in her rented room, staring out the window at the pale yellow wash of the streetlight. And by the time dawn drew near, She had finished packing a small bag with a few sets of clothes, deciding that she would not return to that place again. She had come to understand something that sent a chill down her spine. That the world that had killed her husband and the world of the man she was working for were really one and the same, that she had unknowingly walked straight into the heart of the very thing that had ruined her life. She couldn't let the child soon to be born grow up beneath the shadow of things like that. So when the familiar car came to pick her up the next morning, she had meant to say goodbye and leave forever. But Adriel was there, waiting outside, as if he had already guessed what she intended to do. "You are going to leave," he said, his eyes on the bag hanging from her shoulder. It wasn't a question. "I have to go," she replied, her voice exhausted but firm. "You have to understand me. I can't stay inside the world that took everything from me. I have a child about to be born, and I don't have the right to take risks with that child in exchange for anything. Not money, not even shelter. I've already lost one person to this world. I couldn't survive losing another." Adriel listened in silence until she had said everything, without interrupting, and when she stopped, he didn't try to persuade her with reason or power, the way he did with everyone else. He only spoke slowly, with the honesty that felt unfamiliar even to him. "You have every reason to run," he said. "I don't blame you. If I were you, maybe I'd do the same. But I need you to hear me once. And after that, wherever you want to go, I'll let you go." He stepped a little closer, and for the first time, she saw the man who always built walls around himself lower one brick. "All my life, everyone who came near me wanted something," he said. "Money, power, protection, or they came because they feared me. No one has ever seen who I really am and not run away. Not until you. You stood there in that hallway, after seeing clearly what I could do, and yet you didn't run. You looked at me as if I were a person, not something to be terrified of. You have no idea how rare that is for someone like me." He paused, and his voice dropped lower. "I'm not asking you to stay because of the dog. I'm not asking you to stay for any benefit to me. I'm asking you to stay because I don't want this world to take anything else from you. It has taken enough. Let me stand between you and it. That is the only thing I'm asking you to allow me to do." Marisol looked at him, and her eyes filled with tears again, but this time, not entirely from pain. She realized that the man standing before her, despite carrying everything about him that was frightening, was also standing there with a wound not so different from her own, the wound of someone so used to being left behind that he no longer dared to believe anyone would stay. Two wounded people stood facing each other in the thin light of morning, each carrying a fear of their own. "I can't promise I'll stay forever," she finally said, setting the bag down on the ground, "but I won't run away today. That is all I can give you right now." Adriel gave a slight nod, and in that nod was a gratitude he did not know how to put into words, because for a man who had never been chosen by anyone who stayed, even one day was already a gift. Marisol stayed, and in the days that followed, she began to notice something she had only glimpsed before, and then brushed aside. Bruno, the dog who had now grown gentle enough to let even the gardener stroke his head, the dog who lay still while she cleaned his old wounds and fell asleep at her feet every afternoon, changed completely whenever one particular man came near. Every time Owen Marsh passed through the courtyard, the fur along Bruno's neck would rise, his body would sink low, and from deep in his throat came a dull, rumbling growl, the kind of sound she hadn't heard him make toward anyone else since that night outside the hotel. The first time, she thought it was only coincidence. The second time, she told herself perhaps the dog still remembered Owen as the man who had grabbed her shoulder that night. But by the third time, the fourth time, when she realized the reaction repeated exactly the same way every time and only with one person, she could no longer dismiss it. Her father had taught her when she was a child that animals could read people in ways reason never could, that a wounded dog would smell danger before a human being had time to see it, and Marisol had lived beside animals long enough to trust that more than she trusted people's words. She went to Adriel and told him directly what worried her. "I need you to hear me about something, even though I know it may sound unreasonable," she began. "It's about Owen." Adriel looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Bruno doesn't trust him," she continued. "He's gentle with everyone here, but whenever he sees Owen, he becomes as he was on that first night, guarded, ready to protect himself. A dog that has been treated cruelly by people doesn't react like that unless it senses something. I'm not saying I have proof. I'm only saying this animal has been right about his fear more than any of us, and he's trying to tell us something." I think you should be careful with that man." Adriel was silent for a moment, and Marisol could see clearly that he didn't believe her, or at least that he didn't want to believe her. "Owen has been with me for nearly 10 years, he said, his voice hardening a little. "He has stood between me and bullets more than once. I've placed my life in his hands more times than I have with anyone else alive. You're telling me I should suspect my most loyal man just because a dog growls at him?" "I'm telling you not to dismiss it too quickly just because it's hard to believe," she replied, refusing to step back. "I know this sounds foolish to you, but think back. This same dog, the one your whole team couldn't subdue, understood from the beginning that I wasn't a threat, while everyone here suspected me. He was right about me. I'm only asking you not to assume he's wrong about Owen." Those words made Adriel pause, because she had touched the one thing he couldn't deny. That animal truly had trusted her from the very first moment, at the exact time when both reason and his own men had told him he should be wary of her. But he was used to trusting what he could control. Evidence. Things he could hold in his hand, not the instincts of a dog. "I'll remember what you said," he finally replied, though his voice made it clear that this was only a polite concession, not true belief. Marisol understood that she had said everything she could say, and all she could do was hope that she was wrong, that the dog's instinct wasn't right this time, even though, inside her, a deep unease had begun to rise, one she couldn't put out no matter how hard she tried. What neither Marisol nor Adriel yet knew was that the dog had been right from the very beginning. Owen Marsh had sold himself to the Halloran family many months earlier, during the very stretch of time when the hidden war between the two powers had begun to tighten toward its breaking point. He had calculated everything carefully, a head of security, a man who held every schedule, every weakness, every entrance and exit of the mansion in his hands, was the most valuable commodity Adriel's enemies could buy, and the Halloran family had paid a price that his 10 years of loyalty had turned out not to withstand. All this time, he had continued standing beside his boss, continued receiving his trust, continued playing the part of the devoted subordinate perfectly, while little by little he leaked the very information that would be used to bring down the man who had placed his life in his hands. And the fact that he had hurried to plant suspicion around Marisol had not been coincidence either. He knew the dog was wary of him. He knew that woman had a kind of sharpness he didn't like. Turning Adriel's doubtful eyes toward her was the safest way to keep them away from himself. Now he only had to wait for the right moment. An attack on Adriel's stronghold was not something that could be done recklessly, because the place was guarded too carefully, and his enemies needed one moment when its defenses would be torn open from within, one moment of chaos large enough for them to pour in. Owen had waited for that moment, and then he realized it was coming, not from any tactical calculation, but from the round belly of the woman he had been watching. He had noticed that Marisol had been moving with much more difficulty these past few days, noticed how often she stopped and placed a hand on her lower back, noticed people beginning to whisper that perhaps she would give birth earlier than expected. To a cold-blooded man like Owen, a woman's approaching pain was not something that moved his heart, but a piece on a board. He understood very clearly what would happen inside the mansion on the night she went into labor. Adriel would lose focus. His boss's attention, which was the sharpest thing in that place, would be fixed entirely on her. People would be sent to take her somewhere safe, call a doctor, stand guard. The whole defensive machine would tilt off balance for just a few hours. And in those few hours, the exact opening the Halloran family needed would appear. So he decided, late one night, when the entire mansion had sunk into stillness, Owen quietly went to a hidden corner outside in the garden, where there were no eyes or ears, and made the call he knew would leave him no way back afterward. "It will be soon," he said into the phone, his voice low and cold as ice. "The woman is about to give birth. Any day now. When it happens, this whole place will be in chaos, and he'll be thinking only of her. That's when you come in. I'll make sure the eastern gates are left without guards, and I'll send the exact time. All you need to do is be ready. This one time, finish it." He ended the call and stood motionless in the darkness for a while, and there was not the slightest trace of hesitation or remorse on his face, only the chilling calm of a man who had weighed everything and decided that the lives of those who had once trusted him were worth less than the price people had paid him. He turned back inside, passing through the courtyard where Bruno was lying, and the dog immediately lifted his head, his eyes shining in the night as they followed every step Owen took, a low growl rising from his throat, like one final warning, with no one left there to hear it. Owen cast the animal a contemptuous glance, then disappeared inside, and the darkness closed behind him, carrying with it the scheme that, in only a few days, would descend upon everyone in that house. The first pain struck Marisol close to midnight, 2 days later, while she was still at the mansion later than usual, because the heavy rain had delayed the car meant to take her home. She was sitting beside Bruno when a contraction seized her, so strong and sudden that she had to grip the fence, her breath breaking apart. She knew at once what it was. The baby was demanding to come, earlier than expected, and it wasn't going to wait any longer. Someone hurried to tell Adriel, and within minutes, the entire mansion had shifted into the urgent rhythm of an event no one had foreseen. Adriel came to her himself, and for the first time, Marisol saw a very human panic break through the calm of the man who was always composed. He supported her, his voice trying hard to stay steady. "I'm here. The doctor is on the way. You're going to be all right. Do you hear me? You'll be all right." He ordered them to take her to the most secure room in the house, a room set deep inside, with thick walls and a solid door, built from the beginning as a refuge in an emergency, completely cut off from the rest of the mansion. Bruno ran close at her heels, and no one could stop him. Adriel didn't even try. He let the dog in with her, because he knew Bruno's presence steadied her more than anything else could. But at that very moment of chaos, when every bit of attention in the house was fixed on the woman about to give birth, the opening Owen had promised was torn wide. On the eastern side of the estate, where guards should have been posted, the gates stood silently unattended, and from the rain-soaked darkness of the night, the Halloran men poured in. The first alarm screamed out, ripping through the quiet, and in an instant, the house that had stood as a symbol of order and power became a battlefield. Adriel heard the alarm and understood at once what was happening, and at the same time, a chilling truth drove itself into his mind, that this attack had been calculated to fall on this exact night, at the exact moment when he was at his weakest, and that only a very small number of people had known about that weakness. Marisol's warning about Owen flashed back through his mind like a knife, but there was no time left for regret. He stood before the door of the refuge room and placed one hand on her shoulder through the narrowing gap. "Listen to me," he said quickly, his eyes locked on hers. "You stay in here. No matter what you hear outside, no matter what happens, you don't open this door. Bruno will stay with you. I'll handle the rest." Marisol caught his hand as another wave of pain came over her, wanting to say something but unable to speak, and he only squeezed her hand once, hard, then turned away and closed the thick door behind him, leaving her and the dog inside the last island of peace in the middle of the storm roaring around them. Outside, Adriel stepped into the fight with all the coldness that had made his name. This was his ground. Every hallway, every hidden corner, every turn was something he knew by heart, and the intruders, no matter how many there were or how reckless they became, had stepped into a place where every advantage belonged to its master. He directed his men into position with precision, his voice rising through the chaos, firm and unwavering, every command pulling order back from the middle of disorder. The struggle spread from the garden into the hallways, and Adriel stood at the center of it all, driving back each wave of attack, closing step by step the opening the traitor had made. He was not fighting only to keep his empire. In his mind, in every step he took, there was only one thought holding him upright: the thick door deep inside the house, the woman and the dog behind it, the promise he had just spoken, that he would stand between her and the world that had already taken too much from her. And inside that sealed room, cut off from the noise beyond, Marisol braced herself through each wave of pain, one hand gripping the edge of the bed, the other buried in the warm fur of Bruno as he lay close beside her. And she whispered to herself, to the child about to be born, to hold on, that she and her baby would get through this night. That morning would come. As the battle spread through the house, one of the intruders broke away from the group and followed the empty hallways deeper inside, heading straight for the area where the fortified door was sealed shut. Inside the room, Bruno suddenly snapped his head up. The dog, who had been lying close beside Marisol, sprang to his feet, his whole body rigid, his ears pointed toward the door, and from deep in his throat came a low growl unlike any growl before it. Not fear, not suspicion, but a warning. Marisol, lost in the waves of pain, felt the change too and lifted her eyes toward the dog. She heard unfamiliar footsteps outside the hallway, coming closer and closer, and a cold fear ran down her spine. The thick door would hold, she told herself. It had to hold. But then she heard the stranger begin working at the lock, and she understood that nothing was certain. That was when Bruno acted. The dog who had spent his whole life chained to become a weapon, the dog humans had turned into a source of terror, the creature people thought knew only hatred and violence, now placed himself between Marisol and the door, throwing his massive body forward like a living wall. When the door was forced open and the stranger had only just slipped inside, Bruno was already there, stopping him at the threshold, refusing to let him take even one more step toward the woman lying behind him. This was no longer the panicked animal from that night outside the hotel. This was a living creature that had chosen, for the first time in his life, to protect instead of fear, to stand between danger and the only person who had given him a reason to believe in human beings. The stranger was pinned at the doorway, unable to push past the growling mass of strength blocking his way, and the precious stretch of time that Bruno bought with his courage, second by second, was enough to change everything. Because Adriel had arrived. He had fought his way through the house with only one fear driving him, the fear that he would arrive too late. And when he heard Bruno's growl echo from the inner hallway, he rushed toward it with everything he had left. He appeared at the corner at the very moment the dog was holding the intruder back, and he ended the threat quickly and decisively, placing his own body between the last danger and the door behind him. But that night would not be over, while the man behind it all was still free. Owen had been waiting in the darkness, intending to use the chaos to disappear, and he came face to face with Adriel at the end of the hallway, the face of the traitor finally exposed beneath the light. In that moment, there was no need for many words. They both understood that everything was clear now. 10 years, Adriel said, his voice sinking under the weight of pain mixed with rage. And that was all he said. Owen no longer had any chance to run from the price of the betrayal he had caused, and along with him, the leader of the Halloran family, the man who had ordered the attack that night, and was also the force that had driven Marisol's husband to his death 7 months earlier, had to face the ending they had sown for so many others. When the last sounds faded and quiet returned to the house, a silent kind of justice had been restored, not through grand declarations, but through the fact that those who had caused so much pain could no longer hurt anyone else. Adriel pushed the door open and stepped into the room, and he saw Marisol still there, safe, with Bruno standing guard beside her like a loyal soldier who had just fulfilled the most sacred duty of his life. He knelt beside her, placed his hand over her sweat-soaked hand, and for the first time after that long night, he allowed himself to breathe out. When the first dawn shone through the window, the house had returned to silence, and in that warm room, only life remained, waiting to raise its voice. The doctor Adriel had sent his people to bring had arrived in time, and now all attention was fixed on the sacred moment Marisol had been anticipating throughout her long, arduous pregnancy. She braced herself through the final contractions, sweat soaking her forehead, both hands gripping Adriel's hand as he knelt beside her, and did not move even half a step away. "Keep going," he whispered beside her ear, his voice so gentle that even he did not realize he was capable of speaking that way. "You can do this. I'm here. We're both here." And then, after one final push, the room broke open with a tiny, clear sound, the first cry of a life that had just entered the world. Marisol began to cry at the same time as that little cry, but these tears were nothing like any tears she had ever shed before. They were tears of a happiness so pure that she thought her heart might not be large enough to hold it. They placed the baby in her arms, so small, so warm, wrapped in a soft blanket, and Marisol lowered her face to look at her child for the first time with all the tenderness a mother could give. "Hello, my baby," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "Mama's here. I'm here with you." A baby girl, rosy and healthy, her eyes still shut tight as she nestled against her mother's chest in search of warmth. And in the moment Marisol held her close, all the pain, all the loss, all the long, lonely nights she had lived through seemed to carry a meaning, as if they had all led her to this exact second. She had thought she would step into motherhood in absolute loneliness, and yet now, in a room filled with morning light, she was not alone at all. Beside the bed, Bruno had been lying quietly all this time, his head raised as he watched every movement, and when that first cry sounded, the enormous dog gently stretched forward a little closer, his ears lifted, his head tilted as if he were listening to a miracle he had never heard before. He did not come too close, as though instinct told him that this fragile little life needed to be handled with care. He only lay down at the foot of the bed, rested his chin on his front paws, and kept watch there with the gentlest eyes anyone had ever seen in him. The animal who had once known how to trust no one now lay beside a small family just beginning to take shape, silent and loyal, as if he understood that this was exactly what both he and this woman had traveled such a long and wounded road to find. And Adriel sat there, motionless before the scene in front of him. The man who had spent his whole life knowing only coldness and control, the man used to seeing the world through the lens of power and suspicion, now looked at the woman holding the tiny red newborn in her arms and felt something inside his chest begin to melt, a tenderness he had buried so deep that he had thought it had died in him long ago. "Do you want to hold her?" Marisol asked softly, looking up at him with a tired but radiant smile. Adriel hesitated, his hands, so used to hard things, suddenly awkward. But then he accepted the baby into his arms, careful as though he were holding the most precious thing in the world. And when the child stirred and nestled against his chest, something in that man's heart quietly changed forever, because for the first time in so many years, he touched something clear and untouched by darkness, a new and innocent life that reminded him that amid all the brokenness of this world, there were still things worth protecting, still things worth being gentle for. A few weeks passed, and the house on the hillside found its peace again, the peace it had seemed to lose on that storm-torn night. The traces of that night had been cleaned away. The threat from the Halloran family had vanished along with the man who had led it, and for the first time in a very long while, Adriel no longer had to live inside the constant vigilance that had clung to him his entire life. That afternoon, he came to find Marisol while she was sitting on the porch with her baby girl in her arms, and Bruno curled at her feet. He placed an envelope in her hand, and when she opened it in confusion, she saw inside the papers proving that Bruno's ownership had been transferred into her name, along with the deed to a small house in a quiet suburb, one with a wide sunlit yard and a row of trees before the gate. "The little girl needs a place to grow up," he said softly. "A place with grass to run on, with sunlight, with a dog for a friend. The house is yours, with no strings attached. You don't owe me anything." Marisol looked up at him, her eyes filling with tears, and when she tried to speak, meaning to refuse, he gently interrupted her. "Don't refuse this," he said. "All my life, the things I gave always came with a price. This is the first time I've given something without hoping to receive anything in return. Let me do that, even just once." She couldn't find any words. She only tightened her hand around the envelope, and the baby in her arms stirred softly before nestling deeper against her mother's chest. Adriel looked at mother and child, then at the dog lifting his head to watch him with eyes that had long since stopped being wary, and he did something he had never done before anyone in his life. He bowed his head, slowly, not the bow of a man surrendering, but the bow of one human being to another whom he truly respected. "You taught me something I had forgotten a very long time ago," he said. "That true strength doesn't lie in making others fear you, but in giving them a reason to trust you. You walked into this place as the weakest one here, and yet you turned out to be stronger than all of us." Marisol smiled through her tears, and with her free hand, she took his hand without saying anything, because there are moments when words only make the meaning of them smaller. The afternoon sun settled over the porch, covering 3 people and 1 animal who had all carried wounds they once thought would never heal. And in that warm scene, a family none of them had ever dared to dream of quietly began to take shape. The baby slept peacefully in her mother's arms. Bruno rested his head against her leg, and Adriel sat down beside them, feeling calm in his heart for the first time in his life, like a man who had finally found his way home after a long journey of being lost. Marisol's story reminds us that fate can take many things from a person, but it can never define their true worth, because that worth lives in the kindness we're still able to keep, even when life treats us with its greatest cruelty. Sometimes what heals a broken heart isn't power or money, but simply having someone choose to stay beside us, instead of turning away. And kindness, no matter how small, always has the power to change even those people who seem impossible to move. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press like, and share it so we can keep listening to many more meaningful stories every day. How do you feel about Marisol and Bruno's journey? Please leave a comment sharing the feelings deep in your heart, because we always hope to hear your honest emotions. I wish you, the one listening to this story, abundant health, a joyful life, peace of mind, and calm days always. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next stories.